the first night that we wanted to go there, which I think was Tuesday night, we drove there and you had to read the thing on the wall, on the door, Thursday night.
Oh, wow.
So we went around and we were looking and we ended up going to the Grotto's Pizza place, which is not our favorite place to go.
Right.
So that was just kind of make and do, and that was at 7 o'clock at night, so
Wow.
that was the extent of our dining out, really.
So most of the people going to the beach now are doing it on weekends, I take it.
Well, there's a lot of things that are closed, but there's plenty that are open on here and there.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we don't go to the things where you pay $35 a meal for each person, you know.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
often. We do that twice a year, maybe.
I bet it was quiet over there.
It was, but there are families with kids because they don't have to go to school.
Oh, yeah.
But it was, the beach was pretty much, well, not empty, but sparse and very nice, and the weather was beautiful.
Good. It was a nice week.
Yeah.
Got a lot of outside work done the last couple of days. So I'm glad about that. We were on vacation. I tried one of these paper masks, and I felt like I was breathing a lot easier.
Yeah.
So I thought, I'll just get one and come to church. And I came here and I can't do it without, I was singing and my glasses fogged up. I can't see anything. I'm like, forget this next time, I guess. It's worse than I thought then.
Well, it's just something we need to get used to.
I guess.
This is good social distancing here.
We all get our own too.
Let me take my mask down.
Doug Ryan said he had to run, get some air in one of his tires. He went out and saw his tire, he had a load.
Oh.
So he said he'd be like that. I guess he could do that at Royal Farm.
That's no good to lose air out of your tires.
Oh.
Nope. Okay. Oh, I got 2 minutes yet. I'm starting class at 9:45. Because I am trying to stream this thing. This little crazy thing here is streaming live. Right now we're on YouTube. So hi, at our channel. You can read about it in the bulletin and all that stuff. So you could watch it again if you want. And we're seeing how this works. Tested, it went okay. We have Jacob's Ladder here this week. Those of you watching by video can't see it, but they're going to be doing some HVAC work here, and so they have part of the ceiling down, and there's a ladder there that's up and stuff, so it's supposed to be done by next week, so we'll see. But the ladder is not too troublesome. It'd only be troublesome if you sat in the back. So if you're watching online, you can't do it. I should say, in case you don't know, my name is Jim Kreft. I'm the pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran Church. We are here for a review of Mark's Gospel, and I'm still doing it early, aren't I? I got 1 more minute, although it should be up live right now. So I'll wait 1 more minute in case somebody's coming. Be interesting to see what type of response we get from it, too. Make it a little bigger.
So I could go home and watch this later?
Yes. Actually, we prefer no. Or you can, it will be so wonderful that you'll want to see it several times.
Well, it's good that we could go and see how it does.
He's going to fact check it. That's what you're going to do,
Yeah.
fact check it. That's hard to say quickly, isn't it? Fact check, because it kind of goes together or something like that. Interesting. Okay, I've got time, so we're going to begin. So we're beginning our review of Mark, and next week we'll start some new material. So if you're watching online, my name is Pastor Jim Kreft. You are watching the Adult Sunday Morning Bible Class start up again of our study of Mark's Gospel. We have gone through chapter 8 before the pandemic hit, and today we're going to just do a brief review over everything we've talked about, and then starting next week, then we'll go with new material that will take us beyond this. We'll start in chapter 9, And I have up here one of these lovely little things. Thought I brought some copies down. I didn't bring the copies down. If you want a copy, I can get you one. I can't give you one this big because it's kind of hard to put together, but this is an interesting little illustration of the Gospel according to Mark, where these folks suggest 3 acts, and that's not bad because, interestingly, we've done this act here in our class thus far, the first act through chapter 8. There's one little bit we'll catch on the end here, and this is where we'll be starting up again. And then Act 3 is basically Holy Week type thing. It was interesting to me that today that our gospel lesson is in Holy Week, which is kind of fun. You have to think that through and all of that stuff. So we'll be starting here, and we should start then with a short prayer. We pray. Gracious Lord, help us as we again enter your word. Inspire us, enlighten us, and help us to hear you through it. Continue to transform our hearts and lives through your word. We ask this in Jesus' most precious name. Amen. Now, I gave you some handout type thing. The first verse is the one that we spent time on, and it's quite important, I think. And it simply reads, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that tells you pretty much the whole story of the whole thing. Right at the beginning, Mark's gospel tells us what we need to know. The beginning, the arche in Greek, the good news. It's interesting. Good news, it's proclamation of good news. All of those things can be done. And it is of Jesus Christ. The reason that is highlighted is because that's the question that's going to be asked. Who is this man? And I guess actually we were in this part right here, weren't we? Who do you say I am? Jesus will ask. And then Peter will say, you are the Christ, or you are the Messiah. That's in chapter 8, verse 29. And it's very, very important because that is a statement of faith. But as we looked at it before, he was saying that which he really didn't fully understand yet. And it's not until he gets to the end that we get that. And the second part then is the Son of God. And the second time we're going to hear this is way over here at the end in chapter 15. And it's spoken by a Roman soldier, a Roman centurion on the cross. Truly, this person is the Son of God. And as it notes here, the first person in the story to grasp Jesus' identity in its fullness. Now, we can talk more about that when we get there, but isn't it interesting? Halfway through, Jesus will ask the question. He'll get the correct answer, and then he begins to tell them what it means for him to be the Messiah. That's what we'll be studying in the coming few weeks. And then finally, over at the end, is when it finally comes to its fullness type thing. The good news of Jesus Christ. So, any thoughts? You want to talk more about that? Want me to go ahead? You already got that figured out? They're asleep here. They're sleeping on pillows. I shouldn't say that. People will believe that. Want me to keep going? Okay, I'll keep going type thing. So we're going to look at things like the authorship and all. We spend a little bit of time on Mark, and you can see I put most of the information in there for you to review. A nephew, a cousin, or a cousin of Barnabas. That's why he's so involved with Barnabas. In Colossians 4, it calls him Barnabas' cousin, although some people translate the word cousin differently there. He's a follower of Jesus. The words there try to show it. And the one that I am always interested in is Acts 12, verse 12. As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. That's the fellow we're talking about who wrote, we believe, wrote Mark, where many had assembled and were praying. Michael Card thinks that the Last Supper was held at John Mark's home. Now, the Bible doesn't say that. I think it's what he says he would like that to be true. But, you can say maybe, we don't know for sure. We're uncertain of all of that type of thing. But he is a follower. He will follow along. In chapter 13, verse 13 of Acts, Paul and his companions, that's Barnabas and John Mark, set sail from Paphos, that's Cyprus, come to Perga in Pamphylia, which is southwest Turkey, where John left them and went back home. And so there will be a rift between him and Paul. that will be resolved later on. When Peter breaks out, remember when Peter broke out of prison there and the angel lets him out? We just looked at that a few weeks ago, interestingly enough, in the children's moment. They went to John Mark's house, we believe, type thing. Mark lived in Jerusalem with his mother, whose name is Mary, and they are involved in the early church in Jerusalem. He makes an appearance in the gospel, we believe. It's an interesting one. At least it's thought to be autobiographical. It was the flashing. The young man who they grabbed at him when Jesus was being arrested, and he runs away without anything on. And we believe that is John Mark, interestingly enough. And of course, then he travels with Barnabas and Paul. It says that, it's interesting, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Paul writes this, "Only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you, for he is useful to me in the ministry." And so there was this reconciliation with Paul, and he was working around with him. But then we end up in, as 1 Peter 5, verse 13 says, Peter called Mark his son. And all of the church fathers, those are the early leaders of the church, agree that Mark, it is John Mark, this person who wrote the book of Mark. There's no disagreement among all of them, but it doesn't say, yeah, that's who I am, but we believe that's who he is. And so, with that, I'll stop again. You want me to keep going, or you want to talk a little bit about any of that? Hi, Judy. I'm going on. I'm on the setting, life situation in which was the gospel was written. When we talked about this, we talked about the emphasis of Rome, that Peter ends up in Rome, and we believe that John Mark was with Peter in Rome, and that he's the one that will take Peter's words and put them down in a way. He's asked that by some of the people to do that. There are some extra biblical points that would say that specifically. But the important date is 64 AD, July 29th, where a fire breaks out in Rome. And so this is the famous fire that destroyed a great deal of it. Rumors spread that it was set by Nero's orders. Nero instead would blame the Christians as the scapegoats, and thus begins a persecution of Christians. And it is this group of Christians which will ultimately in this persecution that Peter will die and Paul will die. Hi, Sharon. You think we could go to these maybe?
Okay. Oh, certainly.
Okay. We're on number 3, I guess. That's where we are, I think, on your list. Looking a little bit at setting. And so there is a persecution of Christians. And it's interesting. I think I put it all in there. You know, if you look on page 3 of the notes, there are several bullet points there at the top that really kind of emphasize persecution. And so that Mark's first readers were people in Rome who were being persecuted. And so the first one, Jesus was with the wild beasts, that's kind of unique in Mark's gospel. One reason it may be unique in Mark's gospel is that one of the persecutions that Christians had were wild beasts were let loose in the Colosseum to attack and kill them. Betrayed by an inner circle. We have stories of the first Christians in Rome who people from their own family were betraying them to the authorities. Let's see. The call to discipleship is a call to martyrdom. Take up his cross and follow me, from Mark 8, verse 34. That's one of the ways in which they were persecuted. They had, on the Appian Way, there were crosses all along there, and Christians were put there and killed in that way. So persecution seems to be an emphasis in Mark, and I think it's more an emphasis in Mark because of the first audience, the Romans, who were being persecuted. The last three talk about, on that little list, Jesus stood before a Roman magistrate. They would be standing before Roman magistrates. And then the emphasis with a Roman centurion as well. So all of those seem to fit pretty well with Mark being written in that context, in the context of persecution. So those are all important things to think about as you read through Mark and as we study Mark. Okay? Going on to number 4, major themes. Major themes. These are the, I'm sorry, Jim, yeah.
What's the time frame?
The time frame?
Yeah.
When it was written,
Right.
we do not know exactly. People make guesses. Probably after 64, probably by 70, but those are guesses. Because it does not say, by the way, I wrote this on such and such a day. You know, so we don't have any of those details, unfortunately. We would like to know, but we don't know. I can't go any closer than that, I guess. Yes, ma'am, Judy.
One of the things that you talk about the timing of the authors as it relates to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the way that they talked about the foretold, and yet when it actually happened, they didn't think some of the authors would write past the reflection of what actually happened, that they were in that time. So what you're saying seems to relate with some of the other, Paul Meyer and some of the other developers of critiques kind of go to that time frame that you're talking about.
We were talking when we were on our spiritual retreat vacation thing. Originally, we had planned to go and listen to Michael Card talk about John's Gospel, but we missed that because of, well, you know, there was a pandemic going on, and so we canceled out on that. But we were listening to some of the recorded version of that. And what's interesting that he brought up, and I hadn't thought about a lot, is that we do believe John's Gospel is the last Gospel to be written. I think all biblical scholars, no matter what side of anything they're on, would agree with that. And that it's written late, and so he knows about all of the things. And so it's interesting when you read that he puts in kind of things that haven't happened yet in the storyline itself, but he puts that in kind of like, well, you know that it already did happen and things like that. So I'm not sure Mark does a lot of that. I think John does more of that, interestingly, than Mark does. But that is an important thought. So persecution, so think about, as we go through parts, look at the parts about persecution, because I think you can see more of those in this. And, well, I'll get to that a little bit more. Major themes. The biggest one for me is immediately. Immediately is used 41 times in Mark's Gospel, a total of 49 times total. And so immediately, or at once, or all of those different ways. He says it so many different ways, or it's translated so many different ways, but the emphasis is that it's a movement. It keeps going and going and going. I have read, now this is not, I'm not saying this is the truth, okay? I have read, this is just interesting to think. If we did not have John's Gospel, okay, let's say we did not have John's Gospel, which we have, how long would Jesus' ministry be? Just reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Seems like it would be 1 year if you look at it, right? It goes whoosh. And so some have suggested, and these are not just critical scholars, some conservative scholars have suggested that John's Gospel is not written more in a chronological way, but is more in a circular way instead. And so that there is only one Passover. There are actually 3 listed in there. If you'd like this one over here, this one's open. If you'd like this, or it can sit there. Wherever you want.
Not there.
I kind of like Fred.
Okay.
Good taste.
I noticed it was kinda like Fred. Kinda like Fred. Okay, so immediately, notice that. It's very, very important, and how much and how quickly the gospel goes on. Except, it slows down. Where does it slow down? Slows down in the last week. You will see immediately used, I believe, only one time during Holy Week. It slows down dramatically at that time. But here it seems to be going very, 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 very fast, and then it slows down quickly. How can it slow down quickly? Well, you know what I mean. Suddenly, it slows down. I
Immediately.
find that fascinating.
Immediately it slowed down.
I'm sorry?
Immediately it slowed down.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of fun. Number 2 is the wilderness. The importance of the wilderness. Right at the beginning of the gospel, what happens? We're introduced, we are in the wilderness. John the Baptizer is in the wilderness. Where does Jesus go to be baptized? In the wilderness. What happens immediately after he's baptized? He goes into the wilderness, into the desert. That word that's used, euthus, it's used several times there in, no, it's not euthus, it's eremos. I'm sorry, I used the wrong one. It's mentioned many times in the early chapters. Again, in the early chapters, it changes in the other time. So when Jesus goes to the wilderness, when they go to a lonely place, when they go to the desert, think about why is he going there? Oftentimes it seems like he's trying to go there to be alone with his disciples to teach them. And what happens? The crowd, the mob finds him and suddenly is there as well. And so that's an interesting thing to think about how that happens also. Okay? Messianic secret. I keep going unless you slow me down. Jesus says in Mark 1:44, see that you say nothing to anyone. Why the secret? It's interesting. The reason I put this up here is to again show that after this point, after he asks the questions, what happens? Jesus begins to specifically reveal himself 3 different times to the disciples, showing them, he tells them who he is, what it means, and each time it becomes more and more precise until the 3rd time, it's almost word for word what will actually happen to him. And so here, Jesus is more showing who he is in the first chapters. He isn't responding to exactly. And I think the reason that is because people don't understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. They have different opinions. There are several things that people thought Messiah would be. And so it changes depending on who the individual is. And Jesus will, starting here after he asks the questions and after Peter's response, starting next week, we'll start to see the first one in chapter 9. He will tell them, this is what it means for me to be the Messiah. What Peter said, this is what it means. And it's interesting what will happen. Fiery trial. Loved ones, do not think it is strange, the fiery ordeal you are suffering. That's from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. Again, we talked earlier about the fire and all that that means. And this will fit into the trial, the ordeal will fit into Mark and how he seems to write this gospel. The biggest one to me of this list is the emotional life of Jesus. Do you see all the passages? There are more times where it talks about Jesus' emotional life in this gospel than in any other gospel. I think it lists the numbers there if you read through it, all of that. But look at some of those. Jesus is, well, look at the Mark 1:41. Jesus is moved with compassion. That word always gets to me because it's from the deep inner self. He's moved from basically from the bowels up and such. He's so done. He sternly warns people. He has anger. There are things that you do not see in the other gospels that you see here from good old Mark's gospel that we miss everywhere else. And so, why do you think? Why is there more of the emotion? In my opinion, I'm agreeing with some other folks who have suggested this is really Peter who's speaking. You know, it's Peter, if you will, it's Peter's gospel, Peter telling it to Mark. And Peter, as Peter is shown, is a very emotional person, isn't he? He responds emotionally again and again and again. And so I think one of the reasons Peter noted all of these things, and then it touched him very deeply. Yes, Judy.
Anger. So anger is not a sin because Christ did not sin, or is it righteous anger? Is Peter's anger the same as Christ's anger?
I think if you look at the context, let me pull it up, read it to you. It's over here on this side, and you can do it on the side. That's chapter 3 of Mark. Yes, okay. I didn't want to speak just off the top of my head. I'm going to read to you the incident. This is Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. So what's the emphasis? The problem is not that Jesus heals the guy. The problem is what? When he heals him. It is the Sabbath. Healing is work according to their interpretation of law. And actually, that's probably, I think that's interpretation of oral law as opposed to written law. You have to look at that a little bit. And so that's what they're looking for. Are they concerned about the person? No. So, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, can you see the guy with the withered hand there in Jesus' presence? He probably is even showing him the withered hand. That's me extrapolating, right? And he says to the people there, the religious leaders, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" How do they respond? They were silent. And then that's where the quote comes from. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. So what is the problem? What is Jesus responding to? He's responding to a man who's in need. He's responding to them saying, this is the law as we interpret it. It's more important that this law is followed than the man is. And that is probably a good definition of righteous indignation, righteous anger. I think just to be angry can get you into a lot of trouble. But here's a time when Jesus is upset with how they are responding. Think of it. This man had a withered hand. How would that change his life to have his hand healed? It would change it dramatically and give him a much better life to follow. So I guess it's a long answer to say yes. I think it depends on the context and how it's done, and there Jesus is showing how it is done in that context. Mark 7:34, looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, do you know this context? Remember this guy? Ephrathah, be opened, and his eyes are opened. And so it's done with emotion and all. So it's fascinating. And if you look, we see a lot of them in chapter 8. There's several in chapter 8. And Peter gets rebuked. There's some strong emotion. In chapter 10, let the little children come to me. He's indignant that they wouldn't let the little children come to him. And so then when we get into Holy Week, there is that one in chapter 14, verse 34. I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake. And that was in the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples there. Interesting. So when we go through, look for those times when Jesus is emotional. And it's interesting, if you compare the same incident, if there is a parallel passage, which there are several, compare it to what happens in the other Gospels, and you'll see it come across a little differently. And it's showing you a perspective through Mark's eyes of what Peter had experienced. That's what I believe, at least, and I think that's we can make a pretty strong point for that. Next one, I have different numbers than you. Viewpoint or voice. Each gospel, we have three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. They're very, very similar. John does something completely different. It's written much later. He knows of the other three gospels, we believe, and so he wrote different things down. But here, look at the differences between them. When you think of them, what are the differences and why are they different? Part of it is, again, going to be the life situation in which it's written and to whom it's written. Mark written, first of all, to Christians in Rome, we believe, undergoing persecution. The one that's interesting to me is that third point, I guess. Listen to what they don't say. I gave you some text there from Mark 8, 27 to 30, compared to Matthew 16, 13 to 20. Let me read that for you. The first one, from Mark. Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the road, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them to tell no one about him. So what's left out? This is Mark's gospel. This is Mark's gospel, Peter's recollections, most likely. What's left out? I gave it to you there. It's there. If you read in Matthew chapter 16, I'll read it for those of you who don't have it before you, if you're watching us online. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." "But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then there's verses 17, 18, and 19. Well, I'll jump to 20. Then he gave his disciples orders to tell no one that he was the Messiah. And that's pretty much what Mark said. But what did he leave out? Jesus responded, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth you will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven." Isn't it interesting that this part about Peter is left out of Mark's gospel? Why do you think it's left out? Now, I would expect it to be in there. It's Peter saying, "Hey, what about me?" Cindy?
Peter's humbleness.
Humble Peter? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe the audience, like, if he is writing to the Christians in Rome, then wanting to be not really talking about a single person, but talking more to a group.
Okay. But it's interesting. Now, when I read through this first time, I go, "Why isn't it there?" And when I read through this, and we were doing this, I go, "Something's missing." First thing that came to my mind is something's missing. And so I went to another gospel and I go, "Oh, there it is." I knew it was there someplace. I wasn't making it up in my head. So as you go through, as we look at these things, you may have one of those something's missing, and then you can look at a different one. I have a copy of something this is called Chronological Bible, if you will. Christ Chronological, they call this one, but it's a parallel text one. And on this, they will have the parallel text of all of every place where this would be. And so then you can follow along and do it quickly that way. Otherwise, you get to do page turns in your Bible, which is probably good because then you find the pages and all, but that's a good way to do it as well. Okay? So think about that. What is missing? What is there? The structure, the last part of this little section says, look at the structure. Again, we talked about the structure determined by the first verse, which some people call the table of contents. You know, this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. That brings us here to this, brings us to chapter 8, 27 to 48, brings us to the end of chapter 14 of this man was the Son of God. Right from the beginning, Mark tells you all of this. But look at the other questions to think about. Why is that put here? You know, he put these things together in a certain way. Where is Jesus and why? In today's message, I went through where Jesus is. It's Holy Week. He's in Jerusalem. And that's the context is he's told a couple of parables already. This parable is a follow-up. And he's talking to those religious leaders and showing them, well, you'll have to listen to the message. Is Mark interested in what Jesus does or says? It's more of what he does. There's very little of Jesus' words. 20 minutes, I think, if you read all of the words in red. And in Mark's gospel, I think it's an hour plus, hour and a half maybe if you read Luke's gospel, the words, there's so many more words. Why does he put lots of words? We'll talk a little bit about that as we come up here. Has Mark's emphasis changed in this section? So there are questions to think about as you go through, as we look at this, and ask some of those questions. If I don't ask the question, point it out to me and say, hey, what's going on here? Okay? Take another quick stop. Keep going. I have to find my right page. It doesn't matter. I should mention to those of you who are here in the class, we will continue to provide the one page where we have the text that we're looking at, but we won't be bringing Bibles down and all of that. So if you want a Bible, you need to bring your own Bible type thing. I do have over here, I did print a bunch of them out because they're long type thing. If you want to see what we've done thus far, this one page, set of pages is all of the texts, and then the little Greek help that's on it, that's all collected there. And then this one is all of the, what was it? It was the recaps, I guess I called it. All of the recaps. So if you want that, you can pick one of those up. If you're nice and they're all gone, I'll print you a copy. I decided not to print a bunch of copies because the one thing is 84 pages long, I think. But it's only 42 because I did it back to back. So if you want that and they're all gone, let me know. Okay? I wanted to pull out a few texts from probably the latter part of what we were talking about. I'm in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is interesting because one of the unique things that John does, and it's usually called the Markan sandwich, where there's a story inside the story. You remember the story of Jairus' daughter. When I say story, I don't mean it's made up or anything, but it's the narrative about, okay? So story, I think I can use okay in that way. So Jesus is in chapter 5. This fellow comes and says, my daughter is, she needs help. The rulers, one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, seeing him fell at his feet. My little daughter, she's ill. Please lay your hand on her that she may be well and live. And so Jesus goes with him. And during that going with him, Mark inserts a story. And it's interesting, the story that he inserts is this woman with the issuance of blood. How many years did she bleed? 12. How old was the girl? 12. Interesting, right? Kind of a little, maybe that's why, why he chose to actually put it here as opposed to go. And so this woman is healed, and then we go back to the other story. And it's while he was still speaking, as Jesus still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? It's interesting to note that if she's sick, they thought Jesus could do something. But if she's dead, they don't think Jesus can do something. Kind of a little interesting thing. And Jesus goes with him. And then there will be an amazing miracle of bringing this little girl back to life. That's in verse 41. Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And one of his favorite words is immediately, at once. What happens? She gets up and began walking, for she was 12 years old. So one of the things to look for also is these little Markan sandwiches where he puts things together. Okay? In chapter 6, starting in verse 30, Jesus feeds the 5,000. There are two feedings in the Gospels here. Feeding of the 5,000 and feeding of the 4,000. Some people suggest they're the same feeding retold 2 times, but the text itself shows something different because there are interesting details that are quite different in them. The biggest detail deals with the size of a basket. And you can read that. That's on page 8, I guess. Kophinos, which indicates a small lunch pail-sized basket. In the feeding of the 5,000, how many are left over? There are 12 of them. How many disciples are there? There are 12. Well, the 12 apostles, those. And so it's perfect provision. He provides specifically what's needed. In the second one, the second feeding, is the word used as spives, which is a person-sized basket. And that's used, the other time we run into it is in Acts chapter 9, verse 25. If you remember, Paul is let down out of the city in a basket. Well, it can't be a kophinos, because that would be way too small. Instead, it's this person-sized basket. And there are 5 of them, if I remember right, left over. And amazing of the great number that's there. Instead of just perfect provision, there is great numbers. And when I wanted to jump there to, sorry, let me get there, the turn. It's in chapter 8. I'm looking for Jesus' words. To make sure that we understand that this is different, I think this is why Mark puts this in there. And they began, these are Jesus' disciples, I'm in chapter 8, verse 16, I guess, discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, had said, "Why are you discussing the fact you had no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes you do not see and ears that do not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketful of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said 7. I'm sorry, I said before 5, it was 7. He said to them, "Do you not understand?" So here Jesus is actually, and the disciples are saying there were different amounts. So one is perfect provision, one is amazing, an amazing abundance of showing. And it shows something. Jesus used that to say something about who he is. And going on, chapter 7, verse 1 to 23. I'll put this one in here to emphasize the point. When the Pharisees and scribes often talk about why are you not keeping the law, you have to ask the question, are they talking about the law, written law that was handed down through Moses, those things that are in what we call the Old Testament, or are they talking about the oral law that they say was handed down verbally and then written down years and years afterwards? And many times what they're talking about is the oral law. And this whole command section here is Jesus, he is against the oral law of what they do. For example, in chapter, here we go. In chapter 7, verse 9, "And Jesus said to them, 'You have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God in order to establish your tradition.'" That's oral law there. "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say," oh, you don't want to have Jesus say, "But you say, if a man tells his father and his mother, 'Whatever you have gained from me is korban,' that is given to God," that's Mark telling us. Korban is an Old Testament concept of something that will be dedicated to be given to God, I think for the temple, if I remember right. "Then you will no longer permit him to do anything for his father and mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." And then he goes in talking about defiling a person. It's not on the outside, but it's it defies, it's not the food going in, but it's the heart and all of that instead. Okay? So you have to look out for that part as well. And then he jumps into the Syrophoenician woman's faith. That little subsection there is entitled "Crumbs for Puppies." Do you remember the story? This woman has heard about what Jesus has done, and she wants him to heal her daughter who has an unclean spirit. "Oh, but you aren't Jewish. I can't let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And the word dogs there, when we read through that first time, we kind of think it's like, oh, he's not treating her well. he's calling her a dog, isn't that an insult? But the word used there is this puppy that's the inside puppy as opposed to the outside dog. The Gentiles had pet dogs, where the Jewish people apparently did not have, or at least not as common, I guess. And so it's not one of those outside dogs, but it's one of the pet dogs. We have 2 grand dogs along with 2 grandchildren. And the grand dogs are smart. When the grandchildren are eating, where are the grand dogs? They are at the feet of the children, because they know, first of all, by accident things are dropped. Sometimes grandpa drops things by accidents too, but not as much as they do. But there are times when they're done eating, and what do, Cindy? Drop it right down for the dogs, and the dogs say, thank you very much. That's the type of thing she's talking about. One of these table dogs that is that. And Jesus is so excited by her because from this, he said that I've never seen such, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. Jesus doesn't have to be there. His power is absolute, and he can do it even from a distance. And it's astounding that he can do that. The faith that she has. And so even, here's a Gentile, we see one of those parts going. One of my favorites is in chapter 8, verse 22 through 26, right before Peter confesses. The man at Bethsaida. It's interesting how the healing is done. It's kind of progressive healing. It's not all at once. And I wonder why. Could Jesus just go, you're totally healed? Sure, we see that elsewhere. But what about this one? Why is it different? Now, I don't have an answer, so if you're going to look for it for me, and anything we say would be what we think it is. But it's interesting to consider what is the difference and why is it like that? Again, I don't know. I'm not going to throw out a guess at that point, but kind of interesting how that's done. You know, and he looked up. Jesus said, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, but they look like trees walking. So Jesus lays his hands on him again, opens his eyes, his sight's restored, and he saw everything clearly. It's shown specifically that he saw everything clearly, and he was able to be sent home. Interesting how that happens. And here right now, we're right then at the end about where we stopped at. And this is the first high point, I guess you could really say. And I guess I'll read this part for you. Verse 27, starting there. And Jesus went with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. This is about as far away from Jerusalem and Galilee that Jesus will get, at least that we have listed. He may have gone farther, but we don't have that listed at all. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say I am? Well, you know, there were a lot of different responses, right? And they're telling him the responses that people have been saying, and we've seen some of these thus far. John the Baptist. Well, remember, John the Baptist is now dead at this point in time, and so maybe he's come back from the dead, people are thinking. Except they were contemporaries, that'd be kind of hard, I don't know. And others say Elijah. Why Elijah? Elijah is unique because we have Jacob's ladder here, right? And so all we need is the fiery chariot. Whoosh, up he goes, right? He left. And also it says that Elijah would come as forerunner of Messiah. And Jesus says, by the way, that's who John the Baptist, that's his role that he's doing there. So it could be John the Baptist or one of the prophets. It could be any of the prophets, but there is supposed to be a prophet who would come. You know, Moses talks about that as well. And so that's what people are thinking. Do you notice that nobody, at least they're not willing to say, one of them said that you are the Messiah, the Christ of God. Nobody has said that, at least the people that they are quoting from. I find that interesting. And then Jesus then takes it. I usually talk about the next question kind of where he makes it personal, all right? What about you? Who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. and he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Well, we already looked at that one, right, from the fact that he had this greater section about Peter, but here he doesn't have any of that at all. But did Peter truly understand what he was saying? He doesn't yet fully get it, I don't think, because Jesus will then begin telling what that means. And the first passion prediction, as some have called it, starts immediately there in verse 31. What Messiah means. And Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Is that pretty close to what happened to Jesus? It's almost word for word, right? Now it gets more precise later on. And so obviously they all go, yes, this is good. No, it's not what happens at all. Instead, Peter took him aside. He began to rebuke him. What does it mean to rebuke someone? Is this a good, positive statement about them?
Be sharp and.
No. Can you feel? This is Peter. He probably didn't say it. Well, you know, Jesus, this should never happen to you. This never should happen to you. Peter will get emotional because that's how we see him all the time. You know, it does say, rebuke him. No. And then Jesus rebukes Peter. How do you think Peter would have felt hearing, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man"? Peter's going, what's going on? What's happening? You are the Christ. You are the one that's set apart. The Christ is not necessarily, Christ the Messiah, doesn't necessarily believe you can say that and don't necessarily mean that you are the one who is the Savior of the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But right now, you are the one sent by God. But Peter is saying, but not for that. You should not do this. The disciples, the more Jesus tells them who he is and why he came, can I make this statement fairly? The more they don't understand. That's a pretty good statement, I think. It's shown in these 3 times here. And in John's Gospel, when we were listening through that and all, it seems that as soon as Jesus says something, there's going to be a misunderstanding, complete misunderstanding, not only by the disciples, but by the people not understanding who Jesus is and what he did. Judy.
Do you think that he's, in this time that they're together, you know, we do this, I do the same thing. You think you see a picture, and so you're working through with that thought process. And then someone comes and adds some additional information. It's like, I never saw it that way. And it's like an aha moment. The same thing with these disciples. Do you think he's only giving them even the minimalist that they can handle? Because I don't think they ever saw as we move through and their life experiences after he's gone. First of all, you know, the fact that he's even going to be gone, that he didn't take up arms and do all this. And then the Holy Spirit has to work in them to even bring them to the next level that they are going to be speaking to all these people. I mean, it's almost like he knew, I mean, I'm sure he knew, but I mean, that the confusion is part of the learning process and even opening another door. And then never, ever expecting to be traveling and talking and doing all these other things without the Holy Spirit.
I think it's fair to say that what Jesus came to do, they did not expect. That's pretty obvious. I think it's fair to say that in the Jewish, that's not part of what they saw Messiah would be. We have certain ideas of what we think, and apparently even some of what more I'm learning was even more diverse than what we think. There was not one set belief system. The Jewish, well, it was interesting. We were listening, and Cindy, you might help me if I forget some of the details. She's got the good mind. She remembers all this stuff. But interestingly, now you see I'm going to have said that and go completely forget what I was going to go and say, I told you I had the good mind. And I forget.
The Jewish concept.
Yeah, 70 AD, that's it. 70 AD. I don't think we can overemphasize the importance of 70 AD, because 70 AD, I was learning this from Michael Card, and thinking back through, I think he's correct in this. Others have suggested it as well, that before that point, Judaism is in flux. When Jesus clears the temple, does anyone say what you did was wrong? Do you remember? Nobody said what you did was wrong. What they said was, who gave you the authority to do what you did? And Michael Card, especially when we were listening to him, I guess when I was listening to him, Cindy may have a different viewpoint, but what I'm getting from him is that it's much more diverse, the belief. It's not so clear. It's almost, I don't want to say hodgepodge, but it's kind of a different things. And it's not until 70 AD that when things change. Remember what happened. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. And Judaism, as we know it today, then basically is Pharisees, Pharisaism. What happens to the priests? Well, what was their primary task? Sacrificing, right? There's nothing to how can you sacrifice now? You can't do that anymore. That's gone. So basically, priests are no longer functioning. Sadducees, we don't hear about them anymore either. But basically, that's when everything changes. And so in this time, there's a lot of different understandings, and I think that fits in with what you were saying. They didn't have the idea that God would send his son into the world who would suffer and die for the world to restore us back into a relationship with him. I think there are lots of clues of that in the Old Testament. We call them messianic prophecies. And now looking back, we can go, okay, I see that. It makes sense. God was telling it all along, but they missed the signs. People miss the signs when Jesus is physically there doing it. One of the things I don't think I included in this, which we could have talked about, was they were looking for the things he did, and they missed the even greater things that he had to offer, a restored relationship with God. Yes, it's great. Oh, the food is great. Thank you so much for feeding us in the wilderness when we don't have any food. Thank you for healing. I mean, people are coming for healing, but they're missing the even greater, the spiritual healing. So they're not seeing really the full extent of what he had to offer. And they miss the greater thing by missing the lesson. And I think that reflects back on that was not what they expected at all. Judy.
Where does the city of David fit into Jerusalem and the temple? I don't hear a lot of dialogue. Was that more the Jewish center where they worshipped? Or, I mean, it's right there, but we don't discuss the city of David.
City of David, Jerusalem was the original Jerusalem, which has been expanded.
So when we're
and the temple was, where the temple is, was part of what would have been the original city of David. Of course, what there is now is the Herodian temple, which was rebuilt after the temple was destroyed earlier by the Babylonians. They started to rebuild it, and it's not rebuilt, finished. I'm doing this by memory, which isn't always good. It's getting close to about 70 AD when they finally finish it in all its fullness, and that's when it's destroyed. So what's left now is basically the platform that was the temple, because the temple is all of the mount. It was because there were, when Jesus cleanses the temple, he's in the court of the Gentiles, which is an open area where they were now selling things for sacrificing and all of that. And you've ever been to an open air bazaar, you know that there is lots of going on. And if you are I mentioned in the sermon, a God-fearer, people who are starting to follow the Jewish religion but have not totally converted as of yet, you were allowed on the outside. And where you were allowed is where they're doing all of this stuff. And so that's not a good thing. So that's why Jesus is cleansing that portion. Then there would be the courtyard of the women. Ladies, if you were Jewish, you could be in that part. Then there's the courtyard of the men, which would be even closer. And sorry, ladies, you could not go into that. And then there's then the priest could go closer. And then finally, the one place only the high priest could go one time of year was the Holy of Holies, right? Yeah. That's where the Ark of the Covenant had been originally, but by Jesus' day that was gone. Probably in Babylonian time, we're not exactly sure. And of course, if you believe movies, it's in Washington, D.C. in a case. That's from Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? But that's just a story. And that's a story, made up story, not a story like the Bible story. Okay. So no, they didn't understand what it meant. They did not understand that. And so Jesus then, as we're coming close to the end of our time, says, I'm on verse 34 of chapter 8, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples. So now the crowd's there. He said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now think about it. This is being written by Mark. Primary first audience is Roman Christians who are seeing crosses and people dying. For them, taking up a cross is not to take up a burden, but literally they see crosses and they see people they know dying. Think about that. Take up a cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, well, that's not talking too highly, is it? Of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory with his Father and with the holy angels. And then we go to chapter 9 where we're picking it up next week. So there's a lot happening in Mark's gospel. There's a lot in this section, and in this Jesus is showing by his actions what it means for him to be Messiah. He's bringing God's kingdom. There are different responses. He's doing things that upset the religious leaders. You're healed, your sins are forgiven. Well, for healing's okay, but the forgiving of sins, only God can forgive sins. Only God has that. Well, they missed that clue too, right? And parables about the mystery of God's kingdom. 4 soils, this mustard seed. What do the parables mean? How do they speak to me? So we're catching you up close to where we need to be to start next week. On chapter 9, we'll start in verse 1. Well, there's that little transitional section. And we're coming pretty close then to a transfiguration, which is exciting. Any final questions before we close up for today? Because we're about at the conclusion of our time. Mr. Tim.
When we refer to the wilderness, I always thought that the wilderness is where Jesus went to be with his Father.
I think that's true. Yeah. He goes out to be by himself with them. Sorry, yeah. So he goes to be with the Father. It's a lone place. And there's a history in the Old Testament, especially about going to the wilderness. That's a special place where God's presence is with the people. They kind of have this, we need to go back to the wilderness, even though the wilderness wanderings of the Exodus were terrible and long and all of that. But that's a special place to be with God. And you see that in early Christianity, especially when we start to have people who will go out, and the monks will go out into the wilderness, and that's where, these places are built. I mean, like down in Mount Sinai, down there, and such. But yeah, that is a place. And it's a place also, I think, that Jesus goes to be with his disciples and tries to teach them. And anytime he goes to the wilderness, it seems, geographically up at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, it's kind of, you can see, and so people saw where he's going, and they always seem to end up there. I think sometimes they took the boat to give some time to be away because they can't be there right on there with the boat with them. But as soon as they land, people seem to be there, and they're back again. We want more stuff.
I never thought of it as being teaching. Because don't we, each of us has our own wilderness where we go?
I think there's places where we feel closer to God.
Yeah.
And that can be literally a wilderness, can be a wonderful place.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll draw it to a close there. We'll have a closing prayer, and again, next week we'll meet here again, have some other things for you to pick up next week as well. We pray. Gracious Lord, help us to ponder your word, especially as we go here through Mark. Help us to hear what you have to say for us. Give us the time to ponder it, to think it through, to look at the differences between Mark's gospel and what the others say, to ask some of those questions, but to really try to see you come to life in it, come to life in our lives. So bless us. Watch over us as we go our way this week now. Keep us safe and in your care. We ask it in Jesus' most precious name. Amen. Thank you very much for your kind attention.